The myth of Kubrick is this monolithic figure, this man who knew exactly what he wanted from the very beginning, had a grand plan. What the archive shows us is that he was willing to try anything. It gives us an image of a man who's very flexible, willing to keep trying lots of different ways, lots of different ideas until he gets to what he wants. The Stanley Kubrick Archive was created by Stanley Kubrick himself. It's the material that was created or collected together as part of the research and the pre-production, the production, and even through to the selling of his films. Because he was so involved in every stage of the production process, he gathered together all of this material, all of this information, and then that rested at his house until it was later donated 4 years after his death by Kubrick's family to the University of the Arts London. The archive gives us an insight into a man who so much is spoken about and so much is theorized over, but often isn't really based on primary evidence. Often the material in the archive shows us a very different view of Kubrick as a person and as a filmmaker. Kubrick, most of the time, adapts novels to make his films. This, I think, shows us that whilst he's confident of his abilities as a filmmaker, he's not confident of his abilities as a screenwriter. And usually he's looking at short novels, like Peter George's Red Alert. This is because he's trying to condense a lot of information from a story down into essentially something much smaller, a film. And we have one very nice letter that he writes to David Cornwell, John le Carré, explaining why it is that he can't take one of his novels and turn it into a film. And he explains it in a very friendly but a very Kubrickian way. Unhappily, the problem is still pretty much as I fumbled and bumbled it out to you on the phone yesterday. Essentially, how do you tell a story it took the author 165,000, my guess, good and necessary words to tell, with 12,000 words, about the number of words you get to say in a 2-hour movie based on 150 words per minute speaking rate, less 30% silence and action, without flattening everybody into gingerbread men? This shows us a lot about the character of Stanley Kubrick. He's interested in details, and not only does he explain details to people, he wants to have details explained to him as well. He's interested in telling stories. He doesn't want flat characters. He's much more interested in working on a short, compact story. The archive also shows that whilst he's interested in having a script, the script is not something that he sticks to. Had he have had an unlimited budget, we would have seen a completely different film from Dr. Strangelove. At the beginning of one of the very early drafts of the Red Alert scripts, Kubrick has put together a list of the main characters in the film, and he's given ideas about which real-life characters they should be based on. So we have the president, and he's going to be based on JFK. We also have the British Prime Minister, and he's going to be based on Macmillan. But what's even more interesting about this document is the list of actors that it seems he was contemplating to play the roles. The president was going to be played by Burt Lancaster, a very different actor to Peter Sellers, we would say. And you also have in there Spencer Tracy, you have Orson Welles as the Russian ambassador. That's going to be a very expensive movie to make. One question that's often asked is why Dr. Strangelove is in the title of the film when he's such a bit part, an additional character to the film as a whole. It's arguable that this is a carry-on over from a previous and earlier iteration of the film, which Peter George was working on in the spring of 1962. And he was working on the story of a nuclear scientist who becomes more and more powerful because of his knowledge and his access to the military. And in one of those iterations, he even becomes the president. And this is more of a kind of psychosexual comedy where he rises to power and starts to become attractive because of his prowess and his association with the bomb. The character of Doctor Strangelove obviously is imported into the film that we eventually see, but also some of that sexualized element from that original also is put into the comedy version of Doctor Strangelove.
But with the proper breeding techniques and a ratio of, say, 10 females to each male, I would guess that they could then work their way back to the present gross national product within, say, 20 years.
Originally, the film was going to be named after Red Alert, but after the introduction of the character of Doctor Strangelove, they start to play around with the idea of different titles. And in one insert into a script is basically just taken over with different ideas for the title. One interesting idea that they've put down there is almost like the reverse of the title that they eventually changed with, which is How to Stop Living and Start Worrying. It's all in Kubrick's handwriting, so we can safely assume he's involved in this decision-making process. We have various drafts of scripts for all of his films from Lolita onwards, and they change humongously sometimes. With Doctor Strangelove, we have so many different variations, including one which was to start with a kind of mockery of the MGM opening, but where an alien creature would roar as if it was the MGM lion. And the film would be introduced as an alien race looking at a barren planet and trying to tell the story of how it became a barren planet. This is an idea that Kubrick went back to again when he was looking at AI. The other thing that the archive shows us is that he weaves ideas in and out. We have an introductory piece called General Notes in one of the early drafts of the scripts, and he describes essentially that he wants Doctor Strangelove to be a realistic comedy, and that everything related to the sets and the details that come out in the film are going to portray realism in order to create this kind of sense of nightmare. He also explains that it shouldn't really have comical acting, but just have a comic crescendo on the end of it. And it's debatable, I think, then, whether he really got what he originally intended.
Look at this, Mr. President. This lousy commie rat was taking pictures with this thing on the big board. Mr. Ambassador.
This clumsy fool attempted to plant that ridiculous camera on me.
That's a damn lie. I saw him with my own eyes.
Gentlemen, this is outrageous. I have never heard of such behavior in the war room before.
In the screenplay, President Muffley becomes a very kind of moralizing character. He has big, grandstanding narratives where he explains how he was opposed to the nuclear arms race from the very beginning. And this is all spelt out in the written word. All of this was cut out of the film. And it was cut out of the film at the very end. It wasn't cut out of the script while they were doing it, because we know that it was actually shot through things like continuity reports. And this shows us that Kubrick's finished film isn't finished until the editing process. That's when he starts to put it together. This again shows us a flexible man, a man who doesn't really know what he's looking for until the very end of the process. The film, as you know, has a disclaimer at the very beginning from the US Air Force explaining how none of the events that you're about to see could take place. And it fits so nicely with the kind of realistic nightmare comedy of the film that you think that perhaps Kubrick put it there himself. But we have the letter coming from Columbia Pictures to the cinemas who've already had the film distributed, explaining that they're going to receive an extra roll of film that needs to be cut into it much later on. So the film has already been distributed, and then this disclaimer is being added to it after the fact. So we know that the US military didn't really back Dr. Strangelove. There was no information exchanged between them, which is very different to the production of 2001: A Space Odyssey, where the production team were very closely connected with NASA and other military rocket scientists. We know this because in a letter to a particular military expert, Kubrick explains exactly where they got the information from for how to make the look of the inside of the B-52 and how the communications devices that are so detailed in the way that they're explained and shown in the film. And all that information came from commercially available magazines and books on military aviation. From Dr. Strangelove onwards, as sole producer, Kubrick becomes more interested or more involved in the process of marketing his films. So one fascinating piece of the marketing material for Dr. Strangelove is the press pack. Like all press packs, it comes with stills from the film, little bios of the main actors and actresses, and all of the kind of information you get, but it's all packaged up in an envelope and printed up as if it's a prop from the film. It has the top secret logo and Special Attack Plan R on it. And inside it as well comes this little nuclear bomb effects calculator. And it's very similar to the prop that Dr. Strangelove uses in the film itself, a little numerical dial which you can manipulate to work out how far away you would need to be from a 50 kiloton nuclear bomb exploding at 100 feet. And he becomes incredibly interested in how his films are received and how they're marketed. And it goes to a point where when he receives fan letters, his responses, thanking people for writing in and thanking them for their appreciation. Also, he always adds on a question. How was it received by the people in the audience? And sometimes even going so far as to asking for details about how many newspapers or how many column inches his film was advertised. I think this is indicative of Kubrick not just being a filmmaker wanting to make great films, but also Kubrick, a commercial director, a Hollywood director, wanting to make money. He's not just interested in creating art house pieces that fit within some form of ideological theme that he wants to get across, but he also wants to sell. It seems earlier on in Kubrick's career, he was much more responsive to his fans than later on. From Clockwork Orange, the amount of replies that he makes to fan letters starts to dissipate quite dramatically. The Dr. Strangelove material, and to a certain extent the Lolita material, is much more expansive, and 2001 as well. So those three films seem to be the point where he's starting to receive a lot of fan mail, and he's still responding to almost all of them.
Under the authority granted me as Director of Weapons Research and Development, I commissioned last year a study of this project by the Bland Corporation.
One other aspect of this attention to detail comes out after the film is finished and when he's starting to look at press screenings. And he wants to make sure that the projection of his films is the best that it can be. And so he sends an agent the day before a press screening to the cinema to make sure that they talk with the projectionist, to make sure that the projectionist does a rehearsal before the film is projected the next day for the press. We have a 3-page note which he sent to Tony Harvey, the editor of the film, explaining exactly what he has to do in order to prepare for the press screening at the Columbia Cinema in Shaftesbury Avenue. And he gives individual paragraphs with details about the fact that he needs to go there the day before to make sure that the projectionist does a rehearsal run, that he sets up a set of hand signals so that he can communicate with the projectionist on the day. It's all about the projection, making sure the projection of the film he spent so much time on making is as good as it possibly can be. I think what the archive allows us to do is understand much more about the production process, the different influences that were made on the films, and a little more about Kubrick's decision-making process. This means that we get a much more holistic view of him, his films, and the way that he made them. Essentially, one of the things that the archive does is it makes him more personal.